free. Find out more. Go to cspan.org and click on Podcast.
Now a discussion on faith and politics. The University of Notre Dame hosted this event in conjunction with the inauguration of its new president. This is 2 hours, moderated by Tom Brokaw.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for that extremely warm welcome. On my behalf, and on behalf of the whole University of Notre Dame, I want to welcome you, particularly our visitors, our trustees, our alumni, our advisory council members, and particularly the representatives of nearly 160 institutions that are here with us today. A special welcome, too, to our faculty and staff, faculty and students in attendance. I hope this conference enhances our thinking and teaching at this university. Our students are the one who will have to address the challenges and questions that are raised today. I hope this forum will help them. Special welcome to our panelists, who will be introduced soon. And a very special welcome and thanks goes out to our moderator, Tom Brokaw. Mr. Brokaw, in his more than 21 years as anchor of the NBC Nightly News, has been an intelligent, responsible, informative presence for millions of viewers. He has brought compassion to stories of strife and turbulence, covered multiple global conflicts, and reported from nearly every country in the world. Though he retired in 2004, he seems to be only busier, and in fact recently returned from 2 days in the Hurricane Katrina aftermath, where he camped out in the 9th Ward, where most of the worst flooding occurred. I am a native of Omaha, Nebraska, where Mr. Brokaw did a short stint in his young journalistic career. After working with him the past 2 months, I can say that despite his tremendous accomplishments, his travels around the world, he has certainly not lost a Midwestern warmth, genuineness, and kindness. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Mr. Tom Brokaw.
Thank you, Brother Jenkins.
Welcome to Notre Dame.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Congratulations.
very much. Okay.
So gratifying to see you get that reception as well.
Yeah, it was. It's a great crowd.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It's good to be here. Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's grand to be back at this great institution here in Heartland America. In the many years that I have been aware of Notre Dame, I have only been conscious of one time in which its standards slipped slightly, and it was the year that they awarded me an honorary degree. But nonetheless, I was eternally grateful for that, and I have been saying during my visit here today, I've given commencement addresses all across America. That was at once the most thrilling and intimidating speech that I ever had to make. One of the things I was worried about is, you know, the Irish Americans do have a certain reputation for storytelling and of a robust sense of humor, and could I measure up? My mother was a Conley from County Clare, and I thought maybe I could invoke that. Now, Brokaw is a Huguenot name, and I said, I know I've got a Huguenot name, but I've got an Irish heart, and that's what I claim, because there are very few jokes that began, there were these two Huguenots in a bar. And no songs about Huguenot eyes or smiling. But nonetheless, I worried I was a little short on material, so I called a great Irish-American friend of mine in Boston, and I took him through my material. And he said, that's good, laddie, that'll work. And then at the very end, he said, you need one more line. And I said, I do. He said, here it is. He said, I know your mother's from County Clare. He said, but for purposes of Notre Dame, you'll say that she's from Connemara. And you go there for arthritis, you know. And after 2 weeks, you get it. Well, I did feel connected to Notre Dame at that time and ever since, and I'm especially grateful to be here today. because I believe that the issues that are before us, and this is Father Jenkins' idea, are the most critical issues, not only in this country, but in the global community. Throughout history, our questions of personal faith and religious institutions have been central to our lives. They have contributed at once to our collective well-being, but also to great violence and great turmoil. And once again, we find ourselves in that intersection of sectarian violence and misunderstanding and conflict. And let this be the beginning, then, at this great university, of a dialogue that can take us, if not to common ground, at least to the approaches of understanding who we are, what we believe, why it's important to us, and gaining, if not acceptance of each other's point of view, at least a keener understanding of it. We have a very distinguished panel, which I'm happy to introduce to you now. His Eminence, Oscar Rodriguez, the Archbishop of Tegucigalpa in Honduras, a man who is well known in the church for his work with the poor, returned from Rome recently where they celebrated him. Thank you very much. Dr. Naomi Chazan is a former visiting professor at Harvard and MIT, a former deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset, a leading authority on women's rights, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and African affairs. Dr. Chazan, thank you very much. Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf is the founder of the American Society for Muslim Advancement. He's the imam of a mosque that is just 12 blocks from Ground Zero in New York City. He's a tireless advocate for improving relations between America and the Muslim world, and he's a trained physicist as well. Imam, thank you very much. Thank you. One of America's great public servants from one of America's great families is with us today. Jack Danforth, an ordained Episcopal priest, a former U.S. Senator from his home state of Missouri, former UN Ambassador, and the President's Special Representative to Sudan. Jack, thanks for being here. It's a commentary on the Anglicans that our ordained Episcopal priest, Jack Danforth, is making his first visit to Notre Dame. So we hope for a little conversion before the end of the day here. Let me begin, in fact, by asking Senator Danforth a question that I know is on the minds of so many people that are out here at Notre Dame today. It's a pressing, burning issue of our time, Senator. If Notre Dame beats USC in a couple of weeks, will Coach Weiss be eligible for sainthood instantly, or will we have to wait a couple of weeks?
Tom, let me answer that this way. A few months ago, I was telling a Notre Dame undergraduate that I was going to be here today, and I said, I'm going to be here in connection with the installation of your new president, Father Jenkins. What do you think of Father Jenkins? This young man said, we think of Father Jenkins as a rock star. Now, it's my view that any university that has a rock star should also have a saint.
I'm going to invite you to think along with us today as we conduct this dialogue. I want you to have a dialogue with yourself, if you will, about the issues that we pose to these expert panelists. And by the way, at the end of an hour of discussion up here, we'll be bringing on stage 2 students from Notre Dame and 2 professors in this area as well. But I want to begin with a question that I think is probably central to all of us. Imam, let me begin by asking you, Since your days as a student, have you had a crisis of your faith? Or can you describe for us how your faith has evolved to where you are now?
Yes, certainly I can, Tom, but I'd like to, with your permission, to begin on this occasion of the inauguration of the 17th President to utter a small Islamic prayer for Father Jenkins' success and for the prosperity of this university under his stewardship. It is customary for Muslims to begin any event by invoking the name of God, the one God, the God of Abraham, of Ishmael and Isaac, the God of Abraham and of Moses and of Aaron, the God of Jesus Christ, of Mother Mary, whom Muslims regard as the most meritorious and purest of all women, the God of John the Baptist and the God of Muhammad, whom we believe are all brothers and servants of the one God. I pray that under the stewardship and leadership of Father John, that this institution will even go further in its leadership, both in the academic and in the football arena, that it will certainly be a powerful advocate for the role of religion in the building of the good society, what we call in the Bible the city on the hill, or the good community, something which all people of religion aspire for. I'd like you to join me in this prayer. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. Ghayra al-maghdubi alayhim wa ad-dallin. Ameen. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
To your question, Tom, I was born in Kuwait of Egyptian parents, raised in England, Malaysia, and came to this country at the age of 17. I suffered a major crisis at that time because I didn't know who I was, what I was. And fortunately, I didn't know then of Samuel Huntington and his Clash of Civilizations. Had I been aware of that, it is not unlikely that I may have assimilated this notion of a clash of civilizations and thought that my destiny was to either be Western and anti-Islamic or Muslim and anti-West. Fortunately, I didn't have the benefit of that idea in the marketplace of ideas, and therefore my task was to re-identify myself, and my faith played a very important role in defining the ethical ground on which my future identity as a human being would be anchored. As far as crisis, I've had more of a crisis of faith in men than a crisis of faith in God. And of course, in my own spiritual journey, I've had, like any person on the spiritual path, had moments of lesser of a connection with God and wondering what may have happened. But these are normal things in one's spiritual journey.
Jack Danforth, how did your years in public service affect your own sense of your faith?
I'm sorry?
How did your years in public service affect your own sense of your faith? You were a man of the cloth, but also a man of the people, representing your home state.
Yeah. Well, I think in the Christian tradition, there is, the basic idea of the incarnation, that is that God was in the world, and that there is a ministry of each one of us to be in the world. I was ordained into the ministry of the Episcopal Church. I was never full-time in the parish ministry, however, but in my own mind, the connection between my ordination and my political life had to do with the fact that I was present in the world as the church in the world. So it had less to do with any specific policy arrangement or view of public policy or how I should vote on any issue than it had to do with the general sense of attempting to be a faithful Christian and faithful minister of the gospel, doing the work of politics.
Your Eminence, you've worked extensively, as we know, with the poor, the impoverished. There's not been a great deal of improvement in the underclass of the world in the last 25 or 30 years. In many ways, it's deepened because of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Has that at any point in your life in the church caused you to question your God or your commitment to what you're doing?
Of course, it questions me every time I am visiting the poor communities of my country, of other countries. But questioning, I would say, in the positive way, because we are always challenged. But what can we do in order to improve the situation of our poor people? Only last May, I got an invitation from SIDSE in Europe, is the community of all the agencies of aid of the Catholic Church, to make a tour, but a very special lobbying tour, with the governments of Germany, Belgium, France, and Great Britain, in order to prepare the summit in Gleneagles, Scotland, to have what they, at least they said in words, to alleviate the debt of the third world. Okay, I was very sad last week when I heard what happened in the Assembly of the United Nations, that maybe those beautiful purposes of Gleneagles are not going to be fulfilled. But I will continue. This is a challenge that gives me more strength to continue struggling.
Did you ever think that the church would have, as an ally in that effort, someone like Bono at your side?
Of course, I was marching with him along the River Rhine in Cologne in 1999. We were singing together and whistling together. 10,000 whistles there asking for the alleviation of the debt. And I appreciate him a lot.
Dr. Chazan, do you think about your faith now more than you did when you were a young person, or has it stayed fairly steady during the years?
Well, I started as a kid following the Lord in the Salesian congregation because I love education. That's why I feel so very well here in Notre Dame. This was my original vocation. And of course, I never imagined that I was going to be a bishop, nor a cardinal, of course not. I thought that my vocation was to prepare the young generations in education, and then the young seminarians for the priesthood. When I was called by Paul VI, I can tell you I had a crisis, because I said, this is not my vocation and I will say no. And I was decided to say no. But at a certain moment I got a letter from Paul VI that said, for the good of the Church of Honduras, please accept. What could I say? I said yes, and this is why I'm here.
And the church is grateful. Dr. Chazan, what about your faith? Has it evolved over the years since you were a young student, or has it stayed pretty much the same?
Well, thank you, Tom. I was actually expecting you to ask me, as the only woman on the panel, what I think about the football team. I'm very disappointed in your first question. And let me hastily add...
As a member of the Knesset, you can take liberties with me at any time, as you well know.
I'm taking full advantage of that, sir. I actually am the only Israeli woman I know who is a football fan, and an American football fan. It relaxes me in the conundrum of Israeli politics. And I happen to be a Patriots fan. And when I got, thank you. When I got the invitation from Notre Dame, I said to myself, I'm not sure I can, in all good conscience, come here because you stole Charlie Weiss. On second thought, I decided if he had to come anywhere, it's better that he's here. So let me congratulate you on an excellent decision. That's the first excellent decision. Perhaps the better decision is the decision to install Father John Jenkins as your 17th president. I really think I just met him today, but from what I've read about him on the internet, he sounds fantastic. So congratulations.
We thank God for lots of things, including Google, actually.
And now to answer your question, I really am in a difficult position here because not only am I the only woman, but I'm actually the only person on the panel that, to be quite honest, I would not consider myself to be a religious person. But we have here a minister and an imam and a cardinal, and my mother asked me, what am I doing on this panel? So the only way I can actually, in some way or another, explain my presence is to say that I'm very Jewish. And I'm very Jewish in the sense that I believe very strongly in what I think is the most significant premise of not only the Jewish faith, but of all the great religions, and that is the basic belief in the importance of the human being and in his goodness and in his kindness. And in Judaism, the only time you are permitted not to do something that religion requires you to do is in order to save a human life. That allows you to do anything. And therefore, even though I'm not religious, I am Jewish in the sense that I believe that we have to create a human situation which reflects the divine in his image. And therefore, to answer your question on the crisis, I'm not sure I've had a real crisis, but I've had a lot of blips. Because for many years, there are two axioms that have guided me, I think, since my student days. And they are both Jewish and universal. One is to pursue justice at all costs, to fight against intolerance and discrimination and poverty and inequality. And the second axiom is to seek peace and pursue it. And for 30 years, I'm not that old. I was young when I started. For 30 years, I have been working towards a just peace between Israel and our neighbors, and especially between Palestinians and Israelis. And I was among the first to enter dialogues and discussions and political agreements with Palestinians. And on September 29th, the year 2000, the second Intifada broke out. And we have just completed, or are about to complete, 5 of the most horrendous years of my life. And when the second round of fighting occurred, I felt that a good 20 years, if not more, of effort to bring to some kind of understanding was being defied by and defiled by violence. And it is harder to progress and to fail and to start again than one can imagine. I believe this time we'll do it successfully.
It's a good point of departure for us. Iman, I think a lot of people in this audience and across this country are confused about what is the real Islamic world. Is it the one that you represent in which you reach out to other religions and you have dedicated your life now to having people understand what you believe are the true roots of Islam? Or is it the Islam that I witnessed in my travels this spring? And you and I talked about this earlier today when I went to Iran and went to the Friday prayers and heard the supreme clerics of Iran call for jihad against the United States and against the Israelis. And when I was in the madrasas in Pakistan and heard the clerics there encourage the young people to go to war against the United States, against the infidels. And as we talked earlier, I was in Saudi Arabia, and they have a real struggle going on now in their outlying madrasas, especially where the religious clerics continue, not just in the mosque, but on the internet and on television, to encourage people to join jihad. I read your book, and I want this audience to be aware of it because I think it's important It's called What's Right with Islam, What's Right with America, and in it you have a very specific definition of when war is justified in the Islamic faith, when they're occupied or they're oppressed. Is there in the Islamic community at the moment the kind of roiling debate that there appears to be to those of us on the outside about what's going on in the Islamic world?
Indeed, Tom, this is a very important question, and thank you for asking it. Islam is now viewed as a national security issue in this country, and it is certainly the big question that is facing opinion leaders and the leaders of this country at all levels. It is also facing leaders in the Muslim world who want to see a rapprochement between their countries and their world and the United States of America. The issues, unfortunately, that have divided the West from the Muslim world are only partly theological in nature, and they are more about the issues of power and economics or other assets. Most conflicts, whether it's between men and women, between Hutus and Tutsis, between any two parties, are usually about competing claims on an issue of power or on an issue of asset. The asset could be land, which is the root cause of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It could be power, as it is often in other countries as well. And what happens is when people are dissatisfied, they utilize their deepest values to express what is wrong. For example, in the United States, when we feel wronged, we say this is unconstitutional. There ought to be a law against this. Well, when Muslims feel wronged, because Islam is the religion of law, they say this is un-Islamic. There got to be a law against it. So they look in the fundamental texts, or they go to a mufti and says, indeed, this is unjust. Because our faith shares with both Judaism and Christianity the two fundamental commandments. When Jesus was asked what was the greatest commandment, is to love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. And the second commandment, which is equal to it, is to love thy neighbor, which means to love for your fellow human being what you love for yourself. And Jesus went on to say something of great importance. Upon these two commandments rest or hang, in the St. James Version, the law and the prophets. And all of Islamic law actually emanates from these two principles. And therefore the laws pertaining to liturgy, on one hand, is one set of laws, but the laws pertaining to how we build a society is the other set of laws. So when there is injustice, it is extremely easy for Muslims to utilize the vocabulary of religion to express their sentiments of injustice. And once you have a situation of injustice, I mean, part of my challenge here in the United States is to explain the Muslim point of view. When I'm in the Muslim world, I have to explain the American point of view. And Muslims never tire to say that in spite of all the acts of hostility done by bin Laden and so forth, which are certainly unjustifiable from the point of view of Islamic ethics and we have a principle of a just war, there have been far more innocent Muslim lives that have been the result of collateral damage, whether it's from sanctions in Iraq, from the Iraqi invasion and occupation, or even from the removal of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this is what fuels the animosity in the Muslim world towards America. And therefore my hope and aspiration is that the American Muslim community will be an important interlocutor between this great country, the only superpower today, and the 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide.
That's a very reasoned point of view, Senator Danforth, but the reality is that the gap between the United States and the Islamic world is wider today, I believe, than it was before 2001. That there are, in fact, more young Muslims who are eager to join jihad and have an even darker view. In this country, have the religious institutions, people of faith, as well as the political people, done enough about trying to find common ground with the Muslims here in America, as well as those who live in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, who want to advance a different view of
I think the answer is clearly no. the loudest religious voices, whether they're Muslim voices, Christian voices, whatever, the loudest voices are the people who advocate divisiveness, conflict, differences. The people who believe that religion has an entirely different meaning have been strangely silent. And I think that it's really time for them to speak out. And I think that that's one reason why this particular forum at a Catholic university is important. I mean, it's important for religious people to ask, to debate, to study the question, what is the real function of religion? Is religion to pull people together, or is it to drive them apart? In the world today, worldwide, and also domestically in American politics, the function of religion is to develop wedge issues, drive people apart. The meaning of the word religion, it comes from the same word as the same root as the word ligament, is to hold things together. So in my view, what we need is, first of all, a major discussion. What is the purpose of religion? Holding us together or driving it apart? Which way is it? And if we decide that it is the former, to hold us together, then how can we better accomplish that? We are not doing that right now.
Let me raise some other issues if I can. Professor Chazan, the role of women in Islamic society has been widely criticized in this country, and it's always raised as an issue. But in your faith and the Orthodox sects of Judaism, women are second-class citizens in their own faith. The Roman Catholic Church still does not allow women to become priests. Have we been equitable in our treatment of Islam and how it treats various members of its faith? Or to put it more bluntly, does God have a gender preference of some kind?
No, I don't think she does. Anything I say now would be superfluous. So let me be very brief. I've always considered the standing of women, the status of women, as the best measure of the democratic character of any society and any institution. And therefore, Orthodoxy in Judaism discriminates against women. And I find that all the major religions have problems with giving full equality to women. I think there are the most intriguing revolutions in all the religions. I've met with many Muslim women who are quietly asserting themselves within Islam. I have supported Jewish women who have done the same, and Catholic women. So that doesn't bother me. I don't think that we will be able to win this struggle for a few more years. What I am convinced of is that we must pursue it, because that is the standard of what full equality is about. But let me add one more sentence, if I may, because I want to intrude in the previous discussion as well. I don't think the men should have all the fun. And I want you to know that it is not religion of any sort that is a problem, or religious orthodoxy, and definitely not Islam. I think the problem today is fundamentalism, and it comes in different forms. It comes in Christian forms, and it comes in Jewish forms, and it comes in Catholic forms. And if something causes me not to sleep at night, Tom, it is fundamentalism. Because fundamentalists have all the answers to all the questions. And that terrifies me. And I think it should terrify everybody. So please, do not profile a religion but profile those who in the name of religion assert absolute truth, because religion is about having faith because we doubt.
Your Eminence, Your Eminence, we know that the Catholic Church is a dynamic institution. One of the great moments in my life as a non-Catholic was being witness to Pope John the 23rd when we had the Second Vatican Council and the Church changed dramatically overnight. Is it time for the Church to change again? Is fundamentalism a concern for you within your own Church? Will the role of women change in our lifetime, do you think, within the Roman Catholic Church?
I was delighted listening to Dr. Naomi because I agree totally with her. Fundamentalism is one of the biggest problems in the world nowadays. And of course, Vatican II was one of the biggest changes in Catholic Church, but it didn't stop. And changes continue. So maybe sometimes are not very well publicized. And I believe that this is one of the most powerful signs of the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world, when you see that during all these years after Vatican II, many good things have been achieved. And when you see in perspective, not only those points that make more noise, but the silent work of the Holy Spirit, we really are grateful for the presence of our living God among us. One of them is ecumenism. One of them is what we are making this afternoon here in Notre Dame. This is a Catholic university, but as the role of university is to promote universum, it means the whole, not only a limited perspective of what is humanity. So we have to be open to the dialogue, and not only to the dialogue, because also changing what has to be changed, listening to the other, to the one who doesn't think equally to us, but we can perceive the voices of the Holy Spirit everywhere. This is why I believe the Church continues to change, and of course there is a priesthood for women, as there is a priesthood for the lay men as well. Because as Vatican II says, there is the ordained ministry and the priesthood of the laity. We, the ordained ministers, had a precise task to consecrate the bread and the wine that will be the body and blood of Christ. And the lay men and women have to consecrate their ordinary lives, their mission, their families, their being parents, their children. And so priesthood is everywhere, because we are a holy people. We are consecrated to give life to this world. And when we are reducing the priesthood to only the ordained ministry, we are just impoverishing all this big event of Vatican II. So I believe, of course, we are changing, and we will continue changing according to the voices of the Holy Spirit.
Your Eminence, I've not lost my instincts as a daily journalist. In the paper we read today, the Vatican is about to issue a decree that homosexuals will no longer be accepted in the seminary or considered for priesthood. Do you think that members of the gay community will feel, therefore, that they're second-class Catholics?
I believe that, well, I didn't read the document, and I don't know if it's been published yet. Anyhow, we cannot discriminate people. And of course, the gay community, if they want to follow Christ, they know how to follow Christ, because we have in the gospel what is the Word of God. But what I can say is that nobody is called to the ordained ministry. And of course, there are some requirements as they are for other professions in the ordinary life. For instance, I happen to be a pilot as well. But people who is afraid of flying can never be a pilot because they have some limits. That's why when a person has a special allergy for blood, I know people who just faint when they see blood. They will never be surgeons. There are some requirements. This is the same for the ordained ministry in the Catholic Church. You have to have some special gifts. Not everybody is called to the ministry. And having been a rector of a seminary, I am aware of that the Catholic priesthood is not for the people who are oriented in that direction.
Imam, let me take it to another area, if I may. Let me just say, Your Eminence, it's very clear to me, given your performance here today, why we kept hearing those reports from the College of Cardinals about what a persuasive debater you were inside the Vatican, hearing your answers here today. Imam, let me ask you about the role of an Islamic republic, or an Islamic state. We live in a dynamic world. People are moving around. The future of this smaller and smaller global community is the ability to live with each other within different borders. Why is it necessary to have an Islamic state or an Islamic republic and have the strictures of a religion imposed on a political entity?
Tom, as I point out in my book, America is a Sharia-compliant state. It is compliant with Islamic law. And the reason why is because our Declaration of Independence begins with the lines which say we hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, meaning all of humanity is created equal, which is a fundamental principle of the Abrahamic faith traditions, that we are not society is not divided into castes. Endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable means that we all have them by virtue of being human. And this is our rights. We are given these rights because we are human, unlike the French Constitution, where the Constitution grants rights to its citizens. Our rights are God-given, among which are life, liberty, property, which was added to pursuit of happiness. 7 centuries before these lines were written by Thomas Jefferson, Muslim jurists stated that all of Sharia, all of Islamic law, has 5 fundamental meta-objectives: the protection and pursuit of life, of freedom of religion and practice of religion, of property, of family, and of mental well-being. So when we say in America, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, our rights, our Bill of Rights, which are the 10 amendments of our Constitution, Muslims have a similar notion of what the ideal social contract should be. However, it is also my belief that the notion of an Islamic state has not been coherently defined in modern times because Muslims have adopted a very bad paradigm from Europe, namely the notion of a nation state. Until the end of the Caliphate, Ottoman Caliphate in the early 1920s, the rule was not by virtue of geography and a definition that this geography has to have a homogeneous group, either by virtue of their faith, their language, or their ethnicity. So under Ottoman rule, you had Turks, you had Arabs, you had Jews, you had all variety of Christians, you had Kurds, Armenians. But once we adopted the nation-state concept, it seeded a lot of problems in the Muslim world and Arab world. We created not only Arab and ethnic nationalisms, we also created religious nationalisms. This resulted in the split of India into India and Pakistan. It resulted in Arab nationalisms, which were really alien to the Islamic ethic. But because we adopted the paradigm of a nation-state, therefore the argument became framed in the language of developing an Islamic state. But there are principles of Islamic governance, and it is, many Muslims will tell you that Western European countries, or even the United States of America, scores as high, if not higher, than most demographically Islamic nations in terms of what an Islamic state really means. And therefore, the assignment that is before us today is to define what does an Islamic state mean? What does a Jewish state really mean? What is a Torah-compliant state? What is a Christian state? Is there such a coherence to this meaning? Because only when we can move away from a demographic or liturgical or sociological definition of a state to one based upon the principles of law, as in our state, then we will arrive at a definition which will be useful for us.
Your take on that, Professor Chazan?
My take? Is that an American idiom? My take. Okay, I understood the question. You didn't understand the joke, though. I was born and brought up in Jerusalem. My accent is a fake. It's all book learning. I have to learn the idiom. But I understand that you want me to react to the Imam's comments. And up to now, this has been a very polite panel. So I will politely differ with the Imam. And I want to explain why. I come from Israel. Israel is the only democratic country where there is no separation of religion and state, or what you call separation of church and state, although there are more synagogues and mosques in Israel than there are churches. And for me, that's always been a problem, because I've seen the United States as a model, a democratic model, of the separation of religion and state in order to allow people to have the freedom to believe and to practice and to act as they believe. And therefore, and I'll be a little complicated for one moment, therefore, I really don't think it is possible to separate religion from politics. And you know that very well. Your politics are permeated by religion here. But you can separate the state from religion, and you must do so, because I think it's the only way to separate between the private and the public. And therefore, I do not know what a Jewish state is. I do know what a democratic state is with a Jewish majority, and that's called Israel. I know what a democratic state is with a Christian majority, and I even can conjure up a democratic state with a Muslim majority. And I happen to think that when a Palestinian state is constructed, it will be a Palestinian state with a Muslim majority. But I don't want Christian states or Muslim states or Jewish states. I want states that are free with Christians and Muslims and Jews interacting. And that is where we differ a little bit.
May I respond? Dr. Naomi, we don't...
A rebuttal, but...
No, it's not. We do not differ, actually. I mean, Malaysia is a perfect example of a democratic country with a Muslim majority and non-Muslim minority, which are almost 45% of the population. So the notion of and it is in fact part of our own heritage that we have had multi-religious societies. The point is that you can have, like in Britain, non-separation of church and state. The Queen appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Parliament has to rule on any decisions of theological modification within the beliefs of the Church of England. But you have a separation of religion and politics, which is the point you wanted to make, which I believe is the objective of the Establishment Clause and what we mean by separation of church and state in this country. But the model, in other words, because there is a passionate expression by many Muslims to articulate a definition of what an Islamic state means, just as there were Jews who have developed a Jewish state. You see, we need to define it in a way that, in my opinion, will not look that different, because our principles are the same. Our ethics are the same, whether we are Christians or Jews or Muslims. And as long as we abide by these ethics of our principles, it will result in a country which is democratic, by which we participate in power and in economic pie, and live together harmoniously between the religions.
Let's get Senator Danforth involved in this discussion about this country, because you've written about this eloquently. There are a lot of people, more all the time in America, who believe this is a Christian nation, and therefore tenets of Christendom and Christian values must prevail. And we know the role of fundamentalist Christians and the evangelical movement is becoming more and more active with every election cycle. Does that concern you about where that may be headed?
Yeah, it does. Let me say that it is very important for religious people to be involved in government and to be involved in politics. They're going to insist on it. People, faithful people, believe that it is their responsibility to participate in government, to be good participants in government. That is very different from creating any kind of a religious state. It is very different from having a fixed agenda which is identified as, say, a Christian agenda and trying to implement it in the form of legislation. And that is exactly, in my opinion, what we have to watch. People say, is this a Christian nation? The answer to that has to be no. That doesn't mean that we're putting off Christianity or doing anything other than welcoming Christian people into politics. I mean, a lot of them are. What it does mean is that we cannot have a system which says that there are some people out there who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are non-believers, who are somehow less than everybody else. So the separation of church and state in this country, and I believe elsewhere as well, is absolutely essential as a principle.
What is your assessment of what is going on in America with people and their faith? Is there a renewal, if you will, of faith in this country, people returning to not just their specific churches, but to the idea of who they are in terms of their religion?
Well, all kinds of polls have showed that people in America are religious people, and they believe in God, and they tend to be more faithful in attendance at worship than people in other countries. So I think that's there. But the problem is that I think very recently, say in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been an attempt to form a real religious agenda, political agenda, particularly by the Christian right. And it involves various aspects that they want to legislate. And therein, I believe, is the problem. I think it is a relatively recent development, very recent development, and that it's very divisive.
Your Eminence, among the poor that you work with, who've always been among the most faithful in Central and South America in the Catholic Church, has there been any wavering on their part? And what is your determination about, not the young people at Notre Dame, because we know why they're attracted to this institution, in part it is because of their affiliation with the Catholic Church, but as you travel through the third world and see young people coming up, are they as attached to the Church A and to the idea that a personal faith of some kind is as important to them as it was to their parents or to their grandparents?
Well, I was listening with great interest to the Imam and to Madam Naomi, and I agree totally that the language of today is the common purpose, because all the citizens and members of different religions are human beings. And so this is the base on which we are building faith. Of course, we can differ in faith, but faith has as a common language in the human being and the common good. This is why politics exist, because we are trying to develop a world where we can understand each other, respect the dignity of everyone, and then try to build together something better for humanity. And of course, faith is a great strength when it's well oriented on those principles. Ethics It's not something you got from the outside. It's not like a hat that the church is putting on the head and the heads of everyone. This is your ethics. No, ethics come from the inside, from the best thing you have as human beings, as persons. Ethics is what tells you from your conscience where is the good way and where is the wrong way to follow, to build, to construct your life. And this is for the poor, for the rich, for everyone. When we follow our conscience, when we try to respond for the voice of God that is resounding in every conscience, we can build better things. This is why the poor in the past decades in Latin America were attracted by Marxism, because many Marxists were saying, we are going to help you to come out of poverty. But it was a wrong thing, because it was only illusions. They were promising things that they were never achieved. Of course, there is equality in some communist nations, because all of them are poor. This is not the right answer. The right answer is, how can we as human beings respect each other and try to help each other through solidarity? And this is, for me, the greatest value of our faith nowadays. Try to be solidarious in order to build a better humanity, to have a better conditions for the poor.
Imam, let me conclude this part of the discussion by asking you a question. When you hear a prominent politician, whether it's the president or a member of the Democratic Party or some public figure of some kind, boldly proclaim, God bless America, in the American Islamic community, do they think that that politician or that public figure is thinking about the same God as they are?
Yes, we do. Because we believe that the God of Moses, the God of Jesus Christ, the God of Muhammad are the same God. And to say God bless America, to say God bless the people, I believe is a better saying that God bless the king.
Well, one of the things that we want to do here is include some members of the Notre Dame student body and members of the faculty as well, and we'd like to bring them on now if we can. I'm going to just ask you to come on as I introduce you, because I wasn't given a specific order, if that's okay. Dr. Asma Afsaruddin, a Notre Dame professor in religious studies specializing in Islam and the Quran, with a special emphasis on the place of women in Islam. Dr. Afsaruddin, thank you very much for coming. Did I say Asma right? She wanted me to be clear that her first name is Asma, not Osama. So we wanted to make everyone understand that as well. Professor Lawrence Sullivan is another Notre Dame professor, a widely recognized expert on the religions of South America, especially those practices involving health and healing. He's the author of the Encyclopedia of Religion. Sullivan, thank you very much. Dennis Okello is a Notre Dame graduate student. He's enrolled in the Joan Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies here at Notre Dame. What a wonderful, wonderful gift from Joan. He's worked as a reporter in the killing fields of Rwanda. He's particularly interested in the media and war. Thank you. Kathleen Fox is a Notre Dame undergraduate from Kansas City. She's majoring in theology and religion. She's particularly interested in the relationship between the historical roots of faith and personal faith. Kathleen, thank you. Kathleen, let's begin with you if we can. Your generation, these students that are assembled out here, as they listen to this, does it seem relevant to their lives?
Absolutely. I believe, looking at my own life and my friends and family, that religion remains one of the most important components of our identity. We look at a place like Notre Dame that combines serious academic pursuits with a great deal of respect for the dynamic power of religion in our lives. This is something we have to take on. This is something we have to be responsible for. To draw on a comment that Senator Danforth made earlier, he spoke of the silence that many people have in the public forum about their religion. If we do not want our religion to be profiled by fundamentalists, if we want to define the way our religion is, then we have to take that responsibility. Fundamentalism is the cause of people who don't see their faith in that light being silent, taking the seat back and letting those who have a more violent, a more divisive view define their faith. And as the next generation, we have the responsibility to, and we have the power to change that.
You think the Notre Dame undergraduate student body should be much more involved in outreach programs, both as kind of proselytizers for their own faith, but also as those who are, if you will, on a quest for a greater understanding of what's going on in Islam, what's going on in Israel, what's going on, for example, in the Buddhist world, which we've not talked about here today?
I think the greatest thing that we all first have a requirement to do is to forge a strong personal identity, a strong personal faith. The book that we were asked to read in preparation for this forum, When Faiths Collide by Martin Marty, uses the image of hospitality as a way to enter into interfaith dialogue. We need to, instead of saying that we're tolerant of other faiths, we need to look at them as a guest, not as an other. We need to invite them into our home. And to be hospitable, we have to first have that home to invite someone into. So the first thing we need to do is create our own faith. And then we need to enact this idea of hospitality. We need to invite the other in, and we need to be open to looking at different perspectives. And there's a great risk that comes with that. But that's something that we have to be not too afraid to take on.
Professor Sullivan, Martin Marty, in When Faiths Collide, talks about the concept of hospitality rather than the concept of tolerance, because tolerance can suggest that there's an adoption, if you will, of the other practices. Distinguish that for us. What is the difference between hospitality and tolerance? When do you draw the line in your own faith in terms of dealing with people of another faith? And how do you draw it in a way that it doesn't become either a rhetorically violent confrontation or a physically violent confrontation?
Yeah, I think Marty in his book does a beautiful job. He's drawing on the work of Jacob Neusner and Spinner Halev, two Jewish scholars who point out from their perspective, especially, that the theologies that Christianity generated of tolerance were too minimal and often ended up too far removed from the base convictions of religious actors. In other words, tolerance was based a lot on secular motives of let's all get along, and especially let's not bring up anything serious on which we might disagree. But people in their guts live on serious purposes, and so tolerance meant not turning to those issues that were fundamentally most important to us, that got us up in the morning, that banded us together as communities. So Marty and others are pushing for us to move beyond tolerance to a point where we dig deep inside of ourselves and find our own religious reasons for dealing with the other. And Marty, beautiful man that he is proposing hospitality, being a great host, I would say, to welcome the other in, to learn about the other, and to present oneself as a good host would, to begin an exchange at a deeper level.
Mr. Keller, in Martin Marty's book, he writes about what he calls a seminal work by Father John Courtney Murray. We hold these truths, Catholic reflections on the American proposition. Among those, every foreign land is a fatherland, and every fatherland is a foreign land for Christians. Religious pluralism is against the will of God, but it is the human condition written into the script of history. We could at least do two things. We could limit the warfare, and we could enlarge the dialogue. We could lay down our arms. Based on your very personal and very difficult experience in your home country, are you very hopeful that religion can help do that in this world where there is so much violence, especially in the continent of Africa?
Well, I know that religion is very important. A lot of people around the world define themselves primarily as religious people, and they live religious lives every day. So the question for me is not whether religion is important and whether it continues to play an important role later on, and whether there's hope that ultimately everybody who's religious or think they're religious will be able to get along with somebody else who thinks they're also religious in a different setting. For me, what I think I see is a big problem is, as Dr. Chazan and Senator Danforth have pointed out, is fundamentalism. But as a peace scholar and as a journalist, I ask myself, however, that fundamentalism is growing because extremists feel that people are losing touch with the fundamentals. And that seems ironic, because if we're arguing that religion can be important, how do you reconcile with the fundamentalists?
Asma, let me ask you that. How you deal with fundamental. Do you think that the fundamentalist Muslims in the world get a disproportionate amount of the criticism as opposed to some of the other fundamentalist movements that exist in the world?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is yes, because they usually make the front pages of all the major newspapers of the world. I mean, starting from 9/11 and continuing beyond that, I mean, they are the ones who are making the news. But I think it's already transpired in the previous discussion that there are fundamentalist movements within every faith tradition. I think it is almost an endemic feature of our time where there has been this severe reaction to secularism, and particularly secular modernity, and it kind of expresses the quest for finding adequate answers, which I don't think any particular faith tradition has fully grappled with, but finding adequate responses to these changed circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it often comes out in violent terms, but I think we also need to probe, as some of the other speakers suggested, not just religious causes, but also socioeconomic causes and political causes as well. And there are real and perceived political injustices in the world, infractions of moral laws. People feel disenfranchised in many parts of the world. Globalization is an embedded feature in our lives, and people are reacting to those phenomena as much as they're reacting to religious motivations.
I don't want to create two separate universes up here. So you were listening to what our panel, our distinguished panel, had to say. As you listened to them, Dr. Sullivan, what piqued your curiosity most of all? Were there questions that you had for any of the panelists based on what proclamations that they made? What would you like to explore more that we have not gotten into?
Yeah, really wonderful exchange of ideas, and there were several points I'd like to jump in on, but let me choose one, as you say. Perhaps Senator Danforth, you were encouraging of the religious actor to enter the public forum with a stronger voice. You served in the Senate, you were distinguished in your service at the UN, and these are two settings where, for example, the U.S. Catholic community has tried to enter, and also the larger international Catholic community, with prepared statements on the economy, on everything from stem cell research to the role of women in Beijing. Marianne Glendon, this Harvard professor, headed up a Catholic delegation to the Beijing conference. And I wanted to ask for your appraisal. Is anybody listening, is maybe the rude way to put the question, and maybe a more subtle way is this being presented in the proper and effective way? How can a religious community, I'm picking the Catholic one because here we are, but in what way can a religious community make its voice known in ways that will actually be effective and appreciated?
Let me first pick up on a word that's been used by the new panel and the old panel also, and that is the word fundamentalism. I don't necessarily believe that fundamentalism is the problem. Fundamentalism is a way of looking at religion. I'm not a fundamentalist, but it's simply a way of looking at religion. I think that the problem is certainty. I think that the problem is anybody, whether a fundamentalist or not, is so convinced that he or she knows the will of God and is on God's side, and therefore other people are not on God's side, that they create problems. Now, so I think that the certainty is the issue. With respect to a politician is certainly going to listen to anybody. I mean, that's the job of politics. If you don't listen, you're not going to last very long. So you better listen to what people are saying. But the job of a person in politics in our country is to represent a very broad constituency. And therefore, Kennedy said when he was running for president, Judge Roberts said when he was before the Senate Judiciary Committee, he is not in the business of receiving sort of religious orders from somebody else. He's got to serve everybody. And I believe that that is true. I think that if, say, the Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops, whoever, approach people in politics, if they say, we expect you to vote the ideology of the Catholic Church, they're not going to get very far. If instead they say, we are speaking as one of several participants, numerous participants in public dialogue, and we'd like you to consider this point of view with respect to whatever it is, then I think that that is very useful and very constructive. They should bring their religion into the public forum, but in my view, it's very important to do that with a degree of humility.
If I could just, a quick follow-up, two-sentence question. I have the feeling in your answer, a similar kind of reaction to when Imam Feisal spoke and Professor Chazan, that is that we want to encourage religious actors to speak on the ground, but they end up in sort of a self-canceling dialogue and ruled over by umpires who are largely a secular elite. That's the model of government that we want. We don't want that voice to arrive at some other level of decision making.
It's more than self-canceling, it's destructive and divisive. I mean, the problem in politics in our country right now, and I think in other countries also, is when people say, I know God's will, I'm on God's side, I can translate God's will in the form of public policy, I have a political agenda which is identical to God's agenda, and everybody else is wrong.
Senator Danforth, let me just take you up on that if I can. I've been spending some time with the evangelicals, with Ted Haggard, who's the president of the National Association of Evangelicals in Colorado Springs, and I raised your op-ed page piece that you wrote for the New York Times with him, and he said, yes, we know what we believe. We have strong feelings about that. And we are willing, as citizens as well as practitioners of this faith, I'm paraphrasing here, to take those to the public arena and then let the dialogue begin, let the arguments begin. And we'll say, this is what we believe and this is what we want our public servants to represent for us, and others will have different points of view, and that's how we resolve things in this country.
Fine. But where are the other religious voices? Where are the voices of people who can quote Isaiah saying, my way is not your way, says the Lord. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Where are the voices who say that we speak through a glass darkly? Where are the voices of people who believe that God's transcendence is greater than our understanding of the will of God? I mean, where is that? And I think that's where the silence has been, and I think that's why religious people should enter into this dialogue, not because they're nice people and think we should all, sing Kumbaya. I don't think that that's the essence of it. I think for religious people to speak from the standpoint of their faith and to say that our view of the faith is that we do not totally understand the will of God and that we are going to exercise humility.
Let's move to another subject. If we can, Mr. Okello, you're interested in the relationship between media and the war. You're a reporter covering that war. I think one of the great regrets that most American journalists have is that Africa, and especially violence in Africa, has been undercovered, to put it politely, in this country. What is your conclusion, having been there and now having been back here at the Institute for Peace Studies, about the role of media in explaining the roots of conflict, and then once conflict breaks out, how they continue to report on it to American audiences particularly?
Well, obviously, the media plays a great role. We've seen, for example, what the media did in Rwanda and Bosnia. We know that they have such an influence in the way people react and respond to violence. But sometimes I think that we put the media so high up on a pedestal. The question they would ask you is whether they present new reality, or they just represent what is already present. In other words, what you watch on TV is what you really want them to show you. What you hear is what you want them to say. And that probably is the debate. I personally believe that the media can take a more proactive role. The question will be, will that undermine its so-called objectivity? I think that just like we've all been talking about religious people sometimes taking a more proactive role and not just sitting back and being nice people, proselytizing for peace and understanding. I think the media can also do that and still not lose its credibility. As to how the US media covers conflicts outside of the US, they'll tell you that it largely depends on what the audience here wants. Sometimes that's too lame for me, because I think it's very easy to slip back and kind of say, I have no responsibility. Hopefully that can change.
Let me ask you about your own personal reaction to what you saw in Rwanda. The classic question always is, for anyone, reporter or civilian witness to the horrors of war, how could a God let this go on? How can there be a just God if we have this kind of wanton violence? Did you ask yourself that a lot? I do, and I'm glad we have such eminent people on the panel. I hope they can answer that, because I'm just That's an easy assignment for the afternoon.
Just a reporter. I'm just a reporter. But, yeah, so that's part of the that's part of the reason we're here, I guess, to get answers to such questions. How can there be a God and yet at the same time there's so much suffering, there's so much hatred, so much violence? And I'm hoping that this discussion can shed some light on the nature of God as we all perceive him or her.
Someone said, not entirely, and just after Katrina, by the way, when the president said, with God's help, we'll put this back together, someone said, I thought God was responsible for this. So it works both ways. Your Eminence, how do you answer that?
I think that reducing globalization to the economic side has a great danger, because it's globalization with exclusion. And in many ways, we are concerned that our parts of the world who are excluded nowadays, forgotten totally. And we think that we can live in a world of peace without considering all the peoples of the earth. This is a mistake. That is why John Paul II was appealing strongly that in a globalized world of economy is necessary to globalize solidarity. We were talking recently about the UN, and we have the privilege to have the senator here who was an ambassador to the UN, and all of us know that UN is not fulfilling the main purposes for what they were created, because they were created to promote understanding, peace, and also development for all the nations of the earth. And in my perception, Africa is the forgotten continent, and we have to think about it not only in terms of fear that Africans will invade Europe as illegal immigrants, as we Latin Americans are invading the United States as illegal immigrants. No. We need to promote development in the whole world in order that everyone can stay in their own land. Nobody migrates for willing. They did because they were in need. They needed to survive, to find places to work. So I believe it's necessary to change the mentality of the world today. We cannot think only in terms of privatization and exclusion of all the nations. We have to promote peace and development everywhere.
Iman, share with this audience your personal reaction in the week after 9/11 when Osama bin Laden and other leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban said that these attacks in America were attacks against infidels, and that we know that the hijackers were shouting Allah Akbar in the closing moments, God is great, invoking the name of God as they drove those airplanes and the innocent passengers into the Twin Trade Towers, the Pentagon, Pennsylvania. What was your personal reaction to that as a faithful Muslim and as a naturalized citizen of this country?
You said after 9/11, after Katrina. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
What was your personal reaction?
After 9/11?
To the invocation of God on the part of the hijackers, shouting Allah Akbar, God is great, that it was done for, according to Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants, in the name of Islamic justice.
It's absolutely wrong and false. Islamic law and jurisprudence is absolutely clear on this, that civilians, innocent civilians should not be targets of any violence. And in fact, in the weeks after that, there was a fatwa that was released by 5 of the most well-known Islamic jurists as a result of a request of the Muslim chaplain of the U.S. Armed Forces as to whether it was okay for Muslims in the U.S. Armed Forces to participate in the hostilities to remove the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they unanimously made a statement that what happened on 9/11 is an act of terrorism called hiraba in Islamic law, that it is to be condemned, and that the perpetrators of this act are criminals under Islamic law, and that to go after them and even to kill them was acceptable under Islamic law. Unfortunately, this fatwa, when I got a call from Laurie Goodstein, who was the religion editor of the New York Times, this is before we actually engaged, before the United States actually began the hostilities against Afghanistan. I pleaded with her to put that fatwa on the front page of the New York Times. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And this is part of the challenge that the Muslim community is faced with in terms of trying to amplify the message of the many, many jurists who have unanimously condemned. In fact, many people do not realize that not only did every Muslim country condemn 9/11, but every Muslim country, including Yasser Arafat, the PLO, was supported the removal of the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Professor, you teach at a very Catholic institution. 85% of the student body here are, we believe, faithful communicants. I'm told that attendance at daily mass and prayer services, rosary, is very high here. When they come to you for intellectual curiosity or maybe course requirements in Islamic studies in that part of the world, what is that they have on their mind that most troubles them, that they're mostly interested in when they come to your class? And after 9/11, what was the reaction to studies in this area at Notre Dame?
Well, after 9/11, our enrollments basically went through the roof, especially for the study of Arabic language. I think we had as many as 80+ students in just first-year Arabic. And that's amazing for a place like Notre Dame, where we don't have heritage students. We don't have students of Arab background or that many students of Muslim background. So we're talking about basically nice Irish Catholic students wanting to learn Arabic and wanting to learn more about the Middle East. So it has helped our enrollment considerably. I think most of my students come to my classes out of genuine curiosity and out of a genuine desire to learn. And I'm always surprised by how many tell me that they don't actually trust the news. They don't trust the spin that, for example, CNN puts on certain events that they cover in the media. And they want to learn about Islam from an unbiased source. In other words, they want a scholarly appreciation of the language, the faith as it is lived by actual practitioners, as opposed to being presented as an abstract thing, and particularly as an ideology that promotes violence, which is basically the impression you get from a lot of media coverage, mainstream media coverage, unfortunately.
Ms. Fox, you're a major in these areas of theology and religious studies. What was your own curiosity about Islamic studies after 9/11? Was it piqued in some way? Had you thought about it much before the attacks? have you continued your interest in the Muslim faith?
One of the most interesting things about our country before 9/11 is that we really saw ourselves as separate from conflicts and issues that went on across the country, across the world. And what we didn't recognize was the fact that within our own country, within our own communities, there are people practicing different faiths from our own and living the same lives we do. I was very disappointed in my own community in the days after 9/11 that the Muslim school was forced to close down for, I believe, a week and a half because of the real threat that they perceived to their students in the aftermath. I think our responsibility is to learn about the truth in Islam, to respect it as a real faith, to respect it as a way of life, to see it as possessing greater truth in the way that we regard our own faith, and not to allow ourselves to be tricked into viewing Islam as something different, as something that doesn't fit in with our conception of the world and the way we can all live together.
Back to Marty's excellent book, talking about the risks of hospitality. Who decides which religious groups belong as hosts in communities, especially in the public zones of a nation? Often those who have belonged longer and enjoy the myth of their past sameness see the stranger as a potential violator of the national bond. When citizens sing "God Bless Our Native Land," or in the United States, "God Bless America," one must ask, who is the God who is invoked? Now, we know that there were some very strong feelings in this country after the attacks of 9/11 about Muslims, about Islam, and what it had in mind. In your generation, has that been altered at all? Did you sense immediately a kind of wanting to strike back, determination? Some people called it a pagan religion, some people called it a violent religion. Did you hear those things? And has that changed in the last 3 or 4 years?
I don't think it's changed enough. I think it's a natural reaction to want to lash out when we're hurt. The attack of 9/11 really touched each of us, whether we knew someone who was killed or injured in one of those attacks, because it launched itself against our basic feeling of well-being, our feeling of security. We like to isolate ourselves with people who are like us in a community where we feel safe because we're not threatened. We avoid that. We don't want to associate with someone who's different from us because it threatens our basic beliefs. What we have to do is consciously recognize that in our own behavior and consciously recognize it in others and make a decision to step away from that, to learn to respect other faiths and to learn to recognize individuals, not to recognize Islam as a group of people who are all entirely the same. We would find it ludicrous to call all Christians, to call all Catholics exactly the same. We see in our own faith that there's such a difference in belief and in ideas and in feelings among individuals, and we have to extend that same courtesy, extend that same intelligence about basic people to members of every faith. And it's easier said than done, obviously, but...
Professor Sullivan, help me out here. I think I've got these numbers right. For most of the 20th century, Christians represented about 30% of the world's population, 25 to 30%. And in the closing days of the 20th century, the Islamic population of the world got to about 20%. If current demographic trends continue, and there's no reason to believe that they will not, those numbers will turn by 2025. What are the consequences of that in terms of just sheer numbers?
And just to sharpen this question, which I think is the question of the forthcoming generation, if you factor into that the immigration that is part of a globalized economy and the concentration of knowledge that's part of a globalized media, then we are all in and out of one another's kitchens in ways that are intensely beyond what has happened in the past generations. So Marty's image of hosting strangers and acting as guests ourselves, I think, becomes very pressing. We really need to know, not just pick up more facts than we did in previous generations, but we will have reasons to be working with our coworkers, working with our competitors, working with those we want to form policy together with. It's going to be very pressing on us to understand our deepest motivations with one another in ways that haven't happened before.
As you look at religion on a global scale and the movement of various institutions of religion and faiths, Where do you see China in all of this?
Well, let me say that there's a dimension of this that is important to me, that is especially important in China. I'm a specialist in what was once called tribal peoples, and I think we ordinarily line up a kind of evolutionary scheme of human beings where we think of people associating in ethnic groups or tribal groups as part of an earlier timeline. But if you just think, for example, of Germany, its own reproduction rate, its own birth rate being low, the need to import immigrants from elsewhere. Where are they coming from? From Turkey. But who are they? Large groups, for example, of Kurds. If you look at the rest of Europe, you have people in Italy coming from Senegal or from Ethiopia. You have in France other Francophone Africans. You have people who still reckon their identity in strongly ethnic and tribal terms. And if you look also at the conflicts that are pressing on us that are religious, they happen also to be in these areas, in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, in Central America as well. So we have not, and these ethnic and tribal identities are really rooted in religious practice and belief, a religious worldview which is very unique, and we haven't reckoned with that yet. China has this in spades, if I can put it that way. And China's Religious Bureau of Religious Affairs has wrestled with how to cope with the varieties of peoples, religious groups first of all, but all the various ethnic groups, which are largely groups of Muslims, some hundreds of millions of Muslims who have ethnic identities. I think China is reaching out to find out what kind of policies they will put in place and have given no evidence of how they'll proceed. I would say in that respect they're not much different from a lot of our own theorists in government, how we will proceed. I wanted, if I may, just to ask a question. The Cardinal posed an evaluation of the UN based on its mission. And since this is the beginning of a new era in the university, I thought we could turn the tables a little bit and ask, how do you evaluate the university, not Notre Dame alone, but in providing people to work as collaborators with you on these very tough issues you put forward, dealing with the World Bank? I thought originally to ask you that, but I can see that it applies equally well in the context where Professor Chazan has worked and where Imam Feisal has worked. To what degree are the religious universities offering any special training or collaborators? What grade would you give the contemporary religious or Catholic university in providing people for this mission?
Well, I was impressed when I got the invitation for this forum, because I believe this is one of the first steps forward in that direction. University has to respond, to answer to this common question for humanity. What is the future of the human being on this planet Earth? What kind of future we would like to build in the future? And the university is one of the best places for this, because it's putting together different people from different cultures, to not only have the brain full of ideas, but the whole person. How will you develop new attitudes to life, to future, to your participation, your co-responsibility in the future? And I believe this is very important for all the universities all around the world.
But, Your Eminence, who should take the lead in all this? The institutions, individual religious leaders? Should it become much more a part of the political agenda in whatever country we're talking about? Who should take the lead?
I believe all of us, but especially those who are training the future leaders of the world. And this is people in the university. Then we have to build up the culture of participation. I believe that the political model of the French Revolution is exhausted already, because it was creating like a state that was made of infants, and some few leaders will appear and take the people where they wanted to. No, now we live in a very different world, and we need more participation, more co-responsibility of all the actors of society.
But that's so easy to say here on this kind of a forum at Notre Dame. You're a keen student of this country, Dr. Chazan. It seems to me that we've had more the politics of exclusion than inclusion in the last 15 years across the political spectrum. We've developed all these litmus tests, and unless you meet all of them, you're not invited onto the stage with us.
By the way, I don't think it's a problem just of the United States. I think we live in a world where globalization is a buzzword, but it's also a cover for lots of different types of exclusion. In many respects, the fact that we're closer together is translated into the fact that we're further apart. And if we don't understand that, we can't proceed also with this discussion, but also with lots of other questions that have come up. And because I finally got the mic, I'm not going to give it up for 2 minutes, if I may. And I want to address your question, and then one other question that came up. You asked before, and so did Mr. Okello, where is God? How can you understand in this world of ours that 1/3 of the African continent, which I've studied for many years, is below the poverty line in the 21st century? That over 20% suffer from AIDS? That terrorism, which is the use of violence against innocent civilians to promote political causes, proliferates throughout the world, and by the way, is a crime against humanity of an inordinate order. And people ask, where is God? I live in a country that was constructed on the ashes of the Holocaust. And people asked that question 60 years ago. But there is a Hebrew saying in the scriptures, which unfortunately I was racking my brains for the English translation, so I will give you the Hebrew and translate roughly into English. But the Hebrew is, Hashamayim shamayim ladonai, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, V'ha'aretz natan libnei adam, and earth he gave to human beings. And that is the answer. The heavens are for the Lord, but the Lord has given the earth to us. And every injustice that exists on the earth, every one of us is responsible for. And if we don't take responsibility to correct these injustices, from hunger to violence, then we are at fault, not the Lord. And I think that we have to remember that. And if I may, on a lighter note, because there was a lot of talk about fundamentalism here, and fundamentalism and exclusion, what are they telling us? It's telling us that people are afraid, or as Senator Danforth correctly stated, uncertainty. And when somebody comes along with all the answers, then people are, in a sense, attracted to that. But I don't want anybody here to go away with the impression that they're only religious fundamentalists. There are also secular fundamentalists. So the problem is the fundamentalism, it's the absolute certainty. So one small story, if you'll indulge me, Tom. As I mentioned, I am not a very Orthodox person, and my children went to a progressive school in Jerusalem. And my son came home one day and looked at me and he said, he was in the 3rd grade, and he said, guess what? I learned something very important in school today. There's no God. So I said, well, Shai, how do you know there's no God? And he said, I am absolutely sure there's no God. And I said, such certainty from an 8-year-old, it's great. Where did you learn this? He said, in school. I said, well, better tell me what happened. And the answer is, 2 boys had a fight during recess. One was religious with a head covering, and the other was not, and they were fighting whether there was not a God or whether there was or was not a God, and they really beat each other up, so the teacher took them all into the classroom and had a discussion on God. And after the discussion, there was a vote. It's a democratic school. And I said, oh, you voted on whether there was a God or not? And I said, what were the results? He said, 23 for, 2 against, and 1 abstention. I said, who abstained? He said, me, I wasn't sure. 2 actually were religious, and the 23 were secular. I said, you really voted on God? And he said, yes. I said, wait a minute, stay at home. I've got somewhere to go. And I got into my car and went to my son's teacher's house, knocked on the door, and I said, did you have a vote on God? I was livid. And she said, yeah, what's the matter with that? And this is talking about non-religious fundamentalism. I said 3 things which are unforgivable. Number 1, no democratic country would ever vote on God. Number 2, this was the worst lesson in the tyranny of the majority that I've seen in my lifetime. And number 3, you've got 26 kids there, 3rd graders, who are now convinced that there really is no God, and therefore will belittle faith, and that means we have much more work to do. So fundamentalism is not only about religion, it's about anybody who thinks that they can tell you what to do and not respect difference.
That's a very instructive tale, Naomi. It's also instructive about the differences between an Israeli playground and the playgrounds of my youth in South Dakota. In Israel, they fight over whether there was a God. We fought over a little blonde-haired girl who sat in the 2nd row of our classroom. Professor, you're a specialist on the role of women in Islam. It's a big issue in this country politically. We're going to liberate the women of Afghanistan. We're going to liberate the women of Kuwait. We're going to liberate the women of Iraq, although they were more liberated in many ways before than they may be even now. How do the political goals of this country match up with the Islamic laws and the people who run the Islamic republics with whom we're dealing in terms of the place of women?
In terms of?
Of the place of women. Our expectations and our demands on Islamic countries about the place of women, as opposed to what the men and the mullahs and the people who run the Islamic states think the continuing place of women ought to be in the religion, which is fixed in their judgment in the Quran. How do we resolve that?
Well, I think what's happened is that Muslim women have become a trope for this assumed clash of civilizations between the West and the Islamic world. In this dialectic that's going on between 2 sides, most people forget to ask the women themselves. It's funny how they're denied agency by the very people who are claiming to liberate them from repression and tyranny and oppression. The veil, for example, or the head covering becomes, I think, the most visible symbol of the assumed repression of Muslim women in Islamic societies. And I think the veil is really the most misunderstood phenomenon in the West. What's happening increasingly is that women of this generation, and oftentimes these are the most highly educated, most professional women, who are adopting the headscarf, something that their mothers had given up, but they're going back to it of their own volition because they think it's a very important part of their identity, of their assertion as independent Muslim women, women who have a choice in their lives, who have careers, and who are often pursuing higher education. I think that's the image I think most people find very troubling. Because automatically, in the West at least, we tend to assume this knee-jerk reaction that the headscarf must be a symbol of oppression, whereas many Muslim women who are adopting the headscarf of their own will find it actually to be very much a symbol of liberation and an expression of who they are, the best of their identity. Those kinds of voices are not, again, I don't want to harp on the media too much, and I'm not saying the media does this consistently, but the overwhelming impression that we get is that a woman in headscarf must be a very oppressed person, denied agency, where oftentimes the absolute opposite is true. So I think what's happened is it's become a trope to define otherness, much along the way that Martin Marty has been talking about. We seize on things that apparently dramatize the differences between us and them, and that becomes a very visible symbol. But you hear the same kind of discourse on both sides, because then the more conservative elements in Islamic societies then will also use the image of the Western woman as a rather loose and immoral person to typify the decadence that they perceive in most Western societies. So I think it goes both ways.
So do you think it complicates matters when we make women's rights in a Western sense a very high priority of how we're dealing with traditionally Islamic countries like Afghanistan, for example?
Well, I think women's rights are very important in the Islamic world itself. And in fact, Islam has been fundamentally concerned with women's rights. I mean, if you know the history of the development of Islamic law and rights of men and women, you will realize that from the very beginning, women were given certain rights that actually Western women did not get until the 19th century. For example, the right to hold property in their own names. Husbands did not have any right to the property of women when they married. It belonged exclusively to themselves, and that was a right denied to most women that I can think of in most societies until very, very recently. And Islamic feminism is actually driven by this kind of discourse, that they find empowerment within Islamic laws. And they would argue, of course correctly, that the Quran has been primarily interpreted by men. After maybe the first few generations of early Islamic history, Islamic societies did become very patriarchal. Now that women are now getting trained in the religious sciences, they're able to understand the text for themselves and are able to interpret the text for themselves. We have a lot of powerful women's voices challenging the traditional patriarchal interpretations, and with great results. In a place like Iran, which we immediately associate with repressed women, a lot of the very innovative exegesis is coming right out of there. Again, I think education has made a huge difference.
We're getting close. Mr. Okello, given all that you've witnessed in Rwanda, now you're here in the ivory tower, are you a person of greater faith now, personally, as a result of what you saw and your academic studies, or are you still on the fence?
Well, you're putting me on the spot, but
that's the whole idea.
I hope that when I when I leave here, I will not only have a better understanding, but I will appreciate my faith better. So this is like a journey to that end. More importantly, at the end, if you indulge me for 1 second, I would have loved, and I know there will be more time to discuss this in the future. When we talk about fundamentalists in the way we do and extremists, and Senator Danforth said they're the most strident voices. The big question would be, why is that so? Is it because the message is so receptive to a lot of people? And then at a more practical level, what would be the response of the host of major religions to extremism? What are the practical, concrete responses we can make to extremism? And I know we'll probably learn that in the next, several years, but it would have been nice to hear your esteemed ideas.
Well, there are so many subjects and issues that have been raised here today that I know that Father Jenkins and his long tenure at Notre Dame will create more opportunities for the exploration of them. But let me just say, as an outsider coming in, what a privilege it's been to be with all of you, how instructive it has been for me here today. I hope it has been for our audience as well. I'm grateful for the privilege to have been a part of this. And if I may, I'd like to just leave you with really one of my favorite quotes. You all know about sound bites. That's that one encapsulating comment that somebody makes that we put on television. Maybe the single best soundbite I ever heard in this area came when I was a young reporter in Atlanta, Georgia, and Time magazine had on its cover the question, "Is God dead?" There was a philosopher at Emory who was positing the idea that maybe it's time to re-examine the place of God in our lives. Billy Graham was at the peak of his powers in 1965, and he came to Atlanta. And he got off the airplane, and we had a wonderfully energetic radio reporter in Atlanta by the name of Aubrey Morris, WSB Radio. And Aubrey was totally fearless, and he walked up to Dr. Graham. And he said, "Dr. Graham, is God dead?" Dr. Graham looked down and he said, "No, of course God is not dead." Aubrey said, "Dr. Graham, how do you know?" Dr. Graham put his hand on Aubrey's shoulder and he said, "Because I talked to him this morning." Thank you all very much. We've enjoyed this a great deal. Thank you, man. You were very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our Notre Dame forum, and thank you for coming. Commemorative prayer card as you exit as a memento from today's event. A reminder, buses are at gate 3 to shuttle you to campus.
In a moment,